Are the mics on? Great. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. So nice to see so many faces, all interested in going from small-scale innovation to big-scale innovation. We have an amazing panel. I want to say I'm so sorry that Lydia could not make it. She had a medical emergency, and so she's not going to be here. But we will cover as much as we can between all of us. First thing, I'm just going to have everyone go around and introduce themselves really quickly, and then we'll jump right in. We'll leave 10 minutes at the end for Q&A, so make sure you save up your questions so that we can be interactive. My name is Sujata Bhatt. I'm Senior Fellow at Transcend, which is a nonprofit that helps redesign the core design of school. And prior to that, I ran innovation for Boston Public Schools.
That's great. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Shawn Smith. I'm the former Chief of Schools for Chicago Public Schools and now the CEO of Modern Teacher.
Hi, I'm Cator. I'm the CEO of Digital Promise, and formerly I was at the U.S. Department of Education at the Office of Education Technology.
Good afternoon. Carlos Moreno, co-CEO of Big Picture Learning, and also a very proud New Yorker from the Bronx. Every time.
Good start.
Every time.
I'm going to just have us reverse really quickly and do a 1-minute kind of overview of how your organization is connected to innovation in education. Mm-hmm. So can we start with you, Carlos?
Yeah, totally. So Big Picture Learning's been around for now 22 years, and we have prided ourselves in really helping communities, school teams, districts, systems to establish highly personalized, student-centered, real-world learning communities for young people where they can learn in the real world and have clear applicability in terms of what they're learning in school and connect to that in the real world. We currently have 60 schools across the US, across 25 states, and another 100 internationally across 9 countries.
Thank you.
So Digital Promise is actually was launched in 2011 with the mission. It had a congressional authorization, but no appropriation. That means it had the language but no money. With a mission to spur innovation to advance learning opportunity for all Americans. So it has a great big congressionally authorized mission, but it's a completely independent, outside of government, nonprofit organization. We try to break down the silos between researchers, developers, and practitioners. And so we have networks of schools that we work with. The League of Innovative Schools is one network. We also have our Verizon Innovative Learning Schools, which is a powerful network of middle schools. And then we try to do a lot of storytelling, a lot of ways of making research very actionable and usable, and then stories of innovation in schools.
That's great. And Modern Teacher, his mission is to scale modern learning. We are a network of districts across the United States that are following a common agnostic methodology that is really designed at the behavioral sciences of change management. So we think that you have to win the hearts and minds of people and able to scale the change. And the other key component that I think what we try to differentiate ourselves with is that the idea that we believe the unit of change is the district office. When you're trying to change from within, we think that the district has to put the necessary technological and instructional infrastructure in place for the changes to be able to manifest themselves across the organization. So I think in some ways it's counterintuitive to thinking about the classroom as the unit of change, or maybe the school as the unit of change. When we think of scale, we think those systems have to be in place for the changes to actually resonate and see themselves in.
That's fascinating. So 3 people mentioned networks. I'm guessing we're coming back to networks as a possibility of.
And Lydia would have talked all about networks.
Absolutely. With her book coming out. And Transcend works really in 2 different areas. We want to help communities ignite and advance their journey as they move on a change management process. What does that look like? What is school? What should school be? What do we want our graduate aims to be? How do we help schools create those? And not just schools, but the communities around the schools. And also we help create catalytic models. So models that people are really saying, we want these to be able to be adopted by others, because not everyone is going to build a whole new model from scratch. There are 100,555, I think, school communities in the United States. So of those school communities, everyone needs to embark on a conversation about what education should be in the 21st century, but not everyone's going to build their own new model for schooling. So let's jump right in and think about that big picture of 100,000 plus school communities. How do we even begin to tackle that? What does scaling mean to you guys? What does scaling versus spreading versus sustaining innovation? How do you approach that?
Yeah,
Just
I have
start
a
with
couple
you,
of
Shawn?
thoughts. Yeah, I think the first thing, I think one of the key things, and I think you said this spot on, was that most people probably will not build a new model. So if we start with that premise, we have to think about the fact that change has to happen in the current context of our communities. So when we think about those types of conditions that need to be in place, how do we help leaders create the conditions for the innovation to happen from the bottom up, but actually then create the systems and structures and procedures and practices that don't allow the culture to eat the innovation? And so those are one of the things that we try to think about.
Thank you.
And to add potentially to that, as we think about, this is a hard question, and there are a lot of more process answers more than just like, here's what you do, you figure out what works and tell everyone to do it. We know that doesn't work. So I think really the bottom line is context and how you work with people in their context while not making everybody completely recreate everything and learn everything or research everything all over again. So starting with learning sciences and what we know about how people learn, grounding that in the realities of an individual community, and we can talk about some examples and some sort of adjacencies as well. But really determining what is the challenge you're trying to solve, what is the learning science, what do we know about that, what have other people tried, so that you go into it with kind of an information base, and then add to it your own personal context with the people that are most affected by the challenge, and work on it from there. So that was very general, and I think we can go deeper as we talk more.
So I see there's going to be a lot of agreement on this panel for obvious reasons. So
They want us to disagree,
without question,
it might not
I know, we're gonna get there, I'm sure. But I appreciate, Sujata, you opening the space around the conversation between scale and spread, because we particularly prefer the word spread, because there's something around scaling in that language, when you talk about scaling, that has a bit of this imperialistic kind of colonial, like I'm going to take it and we're going to come in and break into new markets.
Yeah.
And that historically we know doesn't work. So the way we operate and partners with communities and with systems and with school districts to work with them, right, in developing the local capacities, to Shawn's point, that is not just at the school level, but at various entry points, right? So especially if we're talking about truly impacting communities at spread or scale or close to that, it requires that we work at the district level with folks there and at the school level and on the ground. And connected to sustainability is also partnering with the schools to jointly procure funding, right, for sustainability, for continuing that work, so that ultimately our goal is for the schools, although they are part of our network, and there's we believe lots of benefit of being part of a larger network where you can learn and grow and be in community with other folks, like-minded folks engaged in the same work, is also a space for those schools to become more autonomous, where they're not as dependent on the network as we've seen in other places.
Go ahead, and we don't have to go in order, we can all jump in.
I was going to add, and I think that's a great point, part of what I see as I kind of travel the US and walk classrooms in our districts across the country is the question of what is it that we're actually trying to spread or scale. I find that when districts go through the whole strategic planning process, most of the conversations focus on revamping the district's or the school's vision and mission statement. Oftentimes what I don't find are being able to walk through a district and have people with some certainty answer the question, what is the classroom of the future in your community going to look like? And we haven't taken that language and actually in some ways created a new language that helps people define what this is going to look like, and so that they can actually go to work every day and start to work to become proficient in that. I think we've got to move that question down to what does the classroom of the future look like, and then put the structures in place at the district office or in the community or in a network of schools for those things to actually be able to happen.
I love that push, but yet you say your unit of operation is the district. So how do you reconcile those two different things?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. One of the things that Gallup talks about in terms of what people want every day from their jobs is they want role definition and clarity. And so what I want to do is, if I'm a third grade teacher, I want to get up every morning and feel like I'm proficient in my job. And the moment we tell them that a new learning model is going to emerge because of new technologies that need to be adopted in the classroom is the moment I think I'm not proficient anymore. And so I think that we have to give people a clear definition of what this is going to look like, put necessary supports in place for people to be coached up to get to that place. And the district has to do that work. I think that's technological. I think that's instructional. I think that comes with a whole idea of how to build a proficient workforce with this model. Mm-hmm. So that work is at the district office while clearly defining what that looks like in the classroom and increasingly more outside of the classroom as learning is taking place intentionally, I think, throughout the community.
Do either of you want to jump in on that?
Well, I was just going to say sort of stepping up a little bit, kind of to a high level, some of the reasoning behind, people could say, well, why do we need innovation? That's actually not what we're after. We're after people, doing better at what they're doing right now and learn, professional development and teaching people how to do what they're supposed to be doing. So one of the things I think is interesting is to think about, at a conference like this, think about the role of artificial intelligence and machine learning and what that's going to mean for the workforce. There's a study from, I think, about a year ago, McKinsey Global Institute talked about the transitions in the workforce are going to mean that there are going to be enough jobs for people in 2030, which, by the way, is when today's first graders graduate. Okay, so 2030 sounds like it's way out there. It's not. It's first graders graduating from high school. So there will be enough jobs, but that the transitions to the kinds of jobs will be as dramatic as transitions out of, say, agriculture. And so when you think about why we have to really think differently and quickly, we need education to be much more of the advanced team for what's happening in the workforce than sort of a follow-on, let's see what's happening out there and then try to get kids to catch up. So there's a lot happening between education and the workforce. And I, by the way, am not a proponent of we just need to train kids for the next thing. I also want them to very much love today, love what they're doing, be super engaged, lean forward, solve challenges. So I think that some of it is setting the condition, setting that understanding for why are we really thinking differently about the kinds of schools that we need students to have. Last thing I'll say about this is SalCon convened a group of, 150 or so, 125 high school kids, about 2 years ago, I think, and for a Saturday. So I went to sort of observe and see what these kids were talking about. And their job was to design a school, what do you want school to be like? And honestly, the kids designed in one day pretty much all the same things that we would probably design if we had a day all together. So I think that there is more coherence around what people want schools to look like and the engagement in schools and the kinds of skills kids are learning and the kinds of involvement. And by the way, that bodes well for a future workforce if we can, in fact, spread that kind of innovation.
I just wanted to offer something that Shawn had said about teachers and the need and the desire to be proficient. I believe that to be totally true. I also think that teachers, and I'll speak I put my educator hat on, want to make sure that while I know I'm being good at my job, that I'm finding great joy in my work, and that I know what it's in service of, right? So what is the ultimate goal? And I think that also gets into the conversation around how student success is being measured and then the impact that has on educators.
Do you think there's still a fear out there for teachers about what this is going to look like when you talk about machine-human collaboration and you talk about the role of deep learning and in the process and what things could be automated in all of the things that a teacher does over the course of the day? Do you think that's largely driven by a fear of the unknown?
I would say that less than 5% of teachers are even having those conversations. I think that we're much more in a bubble than we think we are. All of our networks put together, if you're looking at the innovation adoption curve, we're really still early on. So how do we really spread that conversation beyond those innovators who are thinking about these things with fear or with excitement, however they choose to approach it.
So maybe we should talk about networks. Networks.
Jump right in.
So I think connecting people with each other, connecting people with stories of what each other are doing, connecting with the powerful learning moments, with the kinds of things that kids are solving, with the with the work they're doing. I mean, shining a big spotlight on those kinds of things, understanding what's happening, so people get a sense of what's possible and how they too could try this in their school or try this at home. So I think that the network effect, being smarter together than the sum of the parts, as they say, I think is one powerful methodology.
Can you define how you're using the word network before we jump on?
Yeah, I mean, there's different kinds of networks, right? So there's a hub and spoke. So there's a hub, and everybody is connected to each other, but only through the middle. I think the more powerful networks are where you convene people around challenges, around cohorts, around ideas, around different likenesses or maybe differences, and then you facilitate connections between them. We find that it's most useful when people are connected around an idea or a challenge or a topic, rather than just kind of chat amongst yourselves. And so a very purposeful, meaningful network is how we think about this.
And meeting through social media, or is it a face-to-face network?
I think
how are you thinking about it?
face-to-face is just priceless. It really is. I mean, getting people together. We just had our League of Innovative Schools meeting, and when people come together and you feel the energy, you feel the interest and excitement, and people are talking about their own innovations in their districts, then other people do, in fact. I'll tell you one actually real quick story. A few years ago, we had a League of Innovative Schools meeting at this conference, actually, now that I remember that. And it was, and we visited El Cajon and Vista schools, their local San Diego schools. Amazing visits, amazing schools. And one of the things that David Miyashiro, the superintendent of El Cajon, said was he started all of his STEM and makerspace in interactions, which were great to participate in and to visit, from a previous visit to Pittsburgh. So it kind of started in Pittsburgh, people visited schools in Pittsburgh, then those districts, those superintendents could go home, bring these practices home. And what happens is then they're not, then they don't feel like they're out on a limb, like doing the cutting edge thing. They're like, oh, no, we're just doing the same thing as those awesome schools in Pittsburgh are doing. So it just gives everybody some air cover. So those are some of the network effects.
Yeah, I completely agree. What I would add to what Karen said, and I think that's so spot on, one of the things that we found and our research showed us, and then when we started to put it in practice, we kind of saw this flywheel take effect, was that context and language really mattered to transcend geographic borders as well as state policies. So what was happening in one district in one state, how to transfer that learning and adopt that to whatever it is for their community at a much faster rate. It mattered when we put a language in place. So we wrote a framework that's agnostic to kind of what it is that it looks like at the end of the process, but it allowed people to share and collaborate at that exact precise moment in time, whether it was defining new learning models or whether it was putting a technology in place to do something different. They were able to have a language to communicate that, and it accelerated the innovation.
Mm-hmm. And I'm assuming that they're also building assessments against that language. Absolutely. And building a ton of tools that align with that. And
then sharing those as well.
Uh-huh. Yeah. So you're crowdsourcing things.
That's right.
Yeah, definitely in-person convenings are what we have found is the genesis for great collaborations across our schools, school leaders, and school-based folks. And it's actually often quite just motivating for us to see when we hear stories of our school leaders and staff, several who are in this space, who are connecting offline, right? Even when we're not the formal convener of our network. Mm-hmm. And then we hear about that secondhand, sometimes thirdhand, about the great things that are happening. And then we're consistently asking for, hey, let us know what you're doing so we can help amplify that to others and the learning that's happening. The other thing that I think, in addition to those convenings and celebrating and being values-based, is also it's a space for folks committed to solving a problem of practice, right? And feeling like you are pushing forward this super like human-centered design that's in the best interest of young people that doesn't always fit in kind of the larger box, and you feel like your colleagues in this work, that you have that shared problem, that shared challenge, and that you want to help tackle and work together. I feel like that's been a really grounding piece for our schools and our network. Just knowing that you're not alone in that work.
Yeah, I think that's fundamental. It's like we're creating a new identity that people can walk into and have a community around. But then that brings up for me always the question of equity as someone who has almost always worked in districts. Even when I was in LA Unified, I could raise funds to send people to these kinds of conferences and convenings, but the majority of other district schools don't have access to that. So how do we not perpetuate privilege? How do we really create equity of access to innovation and innovation networks as we try to spread and scale? Or spread?
Go ahead. Yeah, that's a great question.
That's a great question. So equity, there's a couple things. One, I wanted to, David Brooks just did a quick thing in the New York Times this weekend. I don't know if you saw it, about poverty in Canada. Did anybody read that? It was a great little piece, takes 2 minutes to read. And basically what it said was that in Canada, I wrote down the numbers. So between 2015 and 2017, they reduced the poverty rate by 20%. What they did, 15 years ago they started, so this was, the process was that they went into communities. Now this is, again, to people here who are in schools, it's going to be like, yeah, right, duh. Like you have to go into the community to do the work. Into communities, and say you had 100 people working together, 25 of them, so at least a quarter of the people were people who live in poverty. So they were the ones most affected by the challenge. And they were at the table designing and helping and developing the solutions. The other people were people who were more sort of traditional roles, maybe running a food pantry, or government officials or nonprofits or other people kind of working with them. And so what they did is they all had similar challenges, but the challenge showed up differently in different contexts and different communities. So they all kind of had their own context. And they work towards solving the challenge. At the same time, the role of the network is to be the pollinators, pick an idea from over here and share over here, and kind of move ideas around as people are working to solve that. But I just read the David Brooks thing. I didn't have time to actually dig in and do more research on it, which I definitely will do. But that process of inclusion is absolutely critical. So when we even think about reading achievement or math achievement or whatever, or high school kids that are dropping out, I mean, how often do we actually bring those people to the table to help solve the challenge? If we want to scale innovation or scale solutions, it is going to require that kind of rolling up our sleeves. So when you talk about equity, that doesn't solve like getting, they too getting on airplanes to go work with people, but it is kind of you take the process for there. Equity, yeah, but it's definitely worth figuring out.
Yeah, I agree, and I think kind of taking another lane on that, because I completely agree with that. One of the things that we struggle with is how to expand our network in rural America when you think of equity. 88% of the districts in the US are less than 10 schools. So you think about the districts that can afford to send their teachers to conferences, they're exposed to new ideas. I think there's a potential of a big innovation gap in rural America, just from a lack of exposure to these ideas. So that's one of the things that we're trying to think about, is how do we, make it affordable for rural districts to be able to join the network? How do we, are able to use our technology to scale the ideas that other folks like Cajon Valley, which I think we've got a few folks in the audience from Cajon, they are doing amazing things. It's those types of ideas that we need to continuously try to spread, where a lot of districts just don't have access to these ideas.
So then we're moving to virtual networks less than face-to-face networks.
Yeah, for us, it's a combination. I think you're right. Face-to-face is priceless. We facilitate districts visiting each other. We host a national conference every year on a small scale for our districts, and then a lot of it happens within our technology, because that's a part of the crowdsourcing of ideas and the efficiencies that we can generate because we're following a similar language and methodology.
You have a gleam in your eye.
Sujata, we go back.
Way to start.
So we know that in this country there are about 4 million young people between the ages of 16 to 24 that are either are not in school or not employed. And in terms of lost wages or income tax, that's like $44,000 a year that is kind of like not there. That's not accounted for. And that is a significant population of young people that are not being supported. And I do think that, when we talk about equity, right, and equity of resources, we also know that in so many other sectors, right, when we talk about whether research and development or innovation, once you have an example of something that is successful, that there are resources put into in some of those other areas, such as pharmaceuticals and technology. Not always the case in education, right? So we have board members and business folks in business who look at us and we explain what we've done in 22 years and our impact, and they're like, you're totally undercapitalized, right? Like, great, thank you for telling me yeah, thank you, appreciate
What
that.
are you going to do about it?
Right? Yeah, exactly, right? Board members too. So for us, we feel like we're not obviously the only ones in this space and with that same challenge. Not a scientist, but make a total science analogy, right? Like, folks are familiar with the California super bloom that just kind of took place, right? Like, all of a sudden there are wildflowers growing everywhere in California, and that's because of like this downpouring of rain that we've gotten over the winter and the spring. We're about due, right? And then we're about due, I think, in the education space for that type of support that allow us to ensure that we are serving those that have been kept furthest from opportunity, and really, really try to shift the narrative around this piece around and really communicate to communities that we believe and know that their demography does not need to equal their destiny. So that's the gleam in the eye that you saw.
Okay, I think we're segueing into obstacles. What possible obstacles are you seeing? Really, one roadblock that needs to be removed in order for things to scale or to spread?
I can take one.
Yep.
I wouldn't say it needs to be removed, but I would say it's an obstacle. I think, and this is my point of view, so we can feel free to pick this one apart, but I'm on a little bit of a limb, I think, on this one. I think the majority of sitting superintendents are risk averse today. And
For good reason.
For good reason.
Do you have any superintendents in the audience?
One of the questions that I asked when I did a 2-year research project on superintendents that were leading innovation in their communities and why were they versus other superintendents. And for the most part, most felt, the superintendents answered the question that they didn't feel they had the power to transition traditional classrooms into modern learning environments, whatever definition that may be. And they cited unions and board of educations and the local politics and resources and funding. So one of the things that we're trying to think about is how do we shift the dialogue away from power when it comes to change to influence and helping superintendents think about their influence in kind of moving the needle around this. But I think most today are scared to take this risk.
Does that go back to what
And that's an
Karen was?
obstacle. I think it's a massive obstacle.
I absolutely agree. So it's not that they're risk averse by nature, but their circumstances make them less willing to take risks.
That's a good question. I'm not sure what the answer would be to that.
I would be curious to do a kind of a personality assessment.
Yeah.
I have my sense about what principals are. They are definitely risk averse, and then you kind of wonder where you go to superintendents. But Karen, you had talked earlier about storytelling as being really fundamental. So when you talk about influence, is that what you're moving towards?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and when you think about, how to mitigate that feeling of I'm not going to take a risk, you have to de-risk it, right? You have to figure out what will make this not risky. One is giving them air cover, letting them know this is happening lots of places. You're not really the only one doing this, and giving them examples where other successes are happening so that they don't feel like they're out on a limb.
And there's the power of the network
And
again.
there's the power of the network, the power of the internet, the power of storytelling, the power of data. There's a lot of things that we can do. That said, it's super noisy. It's a noisy space. This conference alone, there's just so many ideas and this is like the most hopeful conference you want to go to in education because everyone's like pitching each other and like, we can do this, and I got this new product, and what do I watch? And, so it's really interesting to think through like what's happening here and how do you break through that noise. Talk about scaling solutions. So I think one problem is how noisy things are, and how to and then how to mitigate through storytelling and through other means.
I want to really come back to that noise issue, but Carlos, I'm sure you have something to say about obstacles.
So definitely I think that the role of a chief executive of a major school district or major smallish, medium-sized school district is challenging, and I do think that there are many that are risk averse. I do think that we need to figure out how we continue to highlight and elevate those that are very courageous and equity focused, more than I think we do nationally. Several who are also in this room, we have leadership from Buffalo, we have leadership from Newburgh, New York, Reno, Nevada. Like there are just so many different leaders that I feel like have led in that way, but we don't always hear about. So I just wanted to mention that. So the question always around, in terms of challenges, I think the way we're continuing to talk about student achievement is one that I always come back to, right? And the need to really talk about developing new forms, right? And new measures for young people's success that aren't in the traditional way, right? That is just really, I feel like, influencing in not positive ways the way teaching and learning has continued to be and hasn't allowed us to shift. I think that needs to continue to be a big part of the dialogue that we have at all levels.
An innovation that needs to happen, way better assessments that people can trust.
My fear on the leadership side of it is, and as I travel and see different communities that are adjacent to each other in different states, the reality is that the dollars in most states follow the kids. And so what I'm seeing is you may have an innovative leader, a courageous leader, aspirational leader in one community that's starting to put some, I think, real delivery models that look a little bit different, maybe some blended learning options, some virtual options for kids, and they're winning kids. The district is growing, where a community right next to them has a declining enrollment and has for the last 5 or 6 or 7 years. So I wonder if we look 10 years out and we allow innovation to happen kind of from the community lens, will we actually create these communities with have and have-nots when it comes to educational delivery models that are very pervasive, much more than they are today? And it's a question that I have, because I can see the trends there. I mean, public education the enrollment in the US is declining. Homeschools on the rise, charter schools on the rise.
Independent schools
are on the rise.
There may be an issue there with fiscal models eventually, but I mean, I think that this comes back to a larger conversation that we had and in other places, but that is innovation then seen as a boutique, privileged thing? I mean, that's what the first round of progressive education essentially became. How do we make sure that this second round of innovation that tries to create more learner-centered classrooms with a whole child assessment approach, how do we make sure that that does not again become a boutique thing? It's the equity issue again.
We're definitely at the pragmatic, I think, leader right now in terms of, I think you had a first wave where you had the early adopters. It's many of you that are here at this conference. It's this next wave now that's kind of much more pragmatic around solutions that I think is going to be a big question.
Anything? So moving to the pragmatic, the title is like beyond piloting. What I think is interesting, like just going back a little bit, maybe closer to the just pragmatic ground here, is the opportunity with data and with the kinds of things we do see at this conference and with the interactions between large data sets where we could in fact get to some things that deserve to be scaled or deserve to be spread much more quickly. So we've been kind of keeping this conversation on the like wholesale change and wholesale classroom and the whole experience. But when you think about like certain things that actually do help people learn mathematics or learn their letters or learn to read or whatever, there are a lot of very hopeful things. And there's data and diagnostics and data sets and the kinds of things that we actually can have hope in. We can, I think about how we will know so much more about how people learn and what kinds of things are supportive for around learner variability. So this is a little bit of a different taking us probably in a completely different path. But I was just looking at, or just somebody was just telling me about a study that was just done on a small tool, again, these small, lightweight tools that supported students with low working memory. Now, if they had done a test of this intervention on all kids, which they did, what they found was that probably on average it didn't make much of a difference. But when they started disaggregating the data, they figured out students with low working memory, it was super helpful. Students with high working memory or better working memory, they got disengaged and left and weren't interested. So when you think about the kinds of things that we can do as we have better data and better diagnostics and better information that are lightweight, that we can put a lot of different places, we're going to be learning so much more about how people learn and the kinds of things that are helpful for certain students in certain contexts and certain situations. So that's it. I know I just changed the subject.
No, you didn't though, because it brings a really interesting point. So I will do a yes and to that. What's the unit of design? Because then what we're talking about is specific interventions. How are we getting to the 100,000 schools? Are we kind of creating a system that integrates that tool with the math tool, with an SEL tool? Is the classroom the unit of change? Is the school district the unit of change? Is a school the unit of change? How are we designing with that? Because like you said, this is the noise problem again. There's so much out there.
Yeah, but I don't actually think it's clear yet. I think all of those things are happening right now. I think some people are designing things that through the internet can be distributed widely. And with 250,000 people trying something, they make rapid changes and iterations based on how people are engaging with something, right? And then, so I think it's all of the above are happening right now, and I think it's another thing we'll learn more about.
I think we're in the...
Up to you.
I agree with you on this. I think we're in a very similar transition phase to how the Internet of Things was built. I wrote an article called The Programmable Classroom that talks about the idea that we actually, teachers every day, have the tools of assessment. They understand, the personalities of their students in the classroom, their interests, their culture, their language. When you think about the multiple vendors that make up just one third grade classroom, from assessments to content to learning management systems to student information systems to curriculum, if we can slowly, as those over the last 10 years have moved from print to analog and then eventually connected to the grid, if those things can be seamlessly designed together to automate parts of the process that a teacher does every single day just manually, and gives more information to the teacher to then design the learning experience, A, in a different way, B, the ability to deliver it differently, and C, to get at the data sets that you're talking about. To me, that's where the innovation will accelerate, and we'll start to see different delivery models.
So the whole push
And I
for
think we're on that
interoperability.
path.
Yeah.
I think we're on that path.
Yeah. And that's beyond piloting, because it's
That's
not
beyond
like holding
piloting.
something so still that you
Yeah.
will tell you in 3 years whether it worked or not or whatever. And it's much more of an iterative.
The organization or the startup that can create the plug and play for all the vendors and gets past the student privacy data sets and
has AI behind it.
And has the AI behind it will be a home run, I think, in terms of an idea. If I had $100 million, that's where I would invest it.
But then we're back
There's
at
probably
the
been that much
classroom.
invested in Newton, for example.
Way more.
But it's
than
one
that.
vendor.
I know.
It's one vendor. And I would argue that it's the one that can bring the 20 together, because districts have a host of partners that they use. That's probably not going to change for lots of reasons that are practical and political.
So the boutique-ish comment always hits a nerve for us, right? Because we've been around for 22 years and have, again, 60 schools in the US and then 100 internationally. And that growth, our international kind of footprint has happened in about half the time. And it was interesting because a lot of the conversations when we have went with systems, with districts, with schools around practices, I think there are a lot of things that are very unique to big picture learning. But then they always gravitate to this piece around the real world learning component, the internship piece.
Yeah.
So because of that, and I think a scale play for us that we found that was very important was the development of our internship platform and application called Emblaze. That is not just for big picture schools, it's for any school, organization, system, district that's interested in supporting their young people to have student-driven real-world learning opportunities and really monitor those and support those holistically. So we have, I know David, I might throw the number out wrong, but we have over 50,000, I think, students currently actively on the platform. And we're excited about how that may continue to spread and develop and, again, not be as boutique-ish in terms of practices that we see in terms of that unit of measure. Like, what is that authentic entry piece to working with young people and like getting them excited about their learning.
And it's fundamental enough that it would catalyze change in the rest of the school model. I think I want one final question and then we open up to the audience briefly. So you talked about sort of one next step that your organization is taking to spread and scale with Emblaze. I wish you guys would each say something as well. What do you see as the next step that you might take?
So two things. We're working on this notion of inclusive innovation and thinking about, so innovation is, big ideas that go to scale is actually the definition of innovation, something that solves a problem and goes to scale, right? So we're thinking about inclusive innovation. So when we talk we work with districts, it's thinking about something you're doing in your district that is in fact somewhat innovative at solving a challenge, and then thinking about who has access to it and who's included, who participates, and trying to go up and to the right. So continue to create innovations, meaning it solves a challenge, and then improving the inclusion, so that you're having many more people, especially, again, this is to build equity, but it's this notion of inclusive innovation. It also gets to what we were talking about before about including people in the process of innovation. And just one thing that we're doing specifically, we just launched something called Innovation Portfolios, and it's an online tool where the League of Innovative Schools districts can publish their own portfolios. So they can say, here's something we're doing. So we're trying to, again, get things out there so people can actually see them. And currently there are like 172 different stories that people have published, and you can search and that kind of thing. So we just launched that right last week, I think. So
Thank you.
That's great. And we're committed over the next 18 months to trying to facilitate a dialogue between a student information system company, a learning management system company, a digital content company, an assessment company, and a voice recognition company, to say, what if we could program all of you together and see what would happen?
That's great. Thank you. We look forward to hearing from that. There is so much expertise in this room. I welcome you guys to join into a conversation with the panelists. Anybody want to jump in? Please.
You answered the question about obstacles to innovation. Thank you. When you asked, we're discussing the question about obstacles to innovation, there was a lot of, I think, a reference to politics and unions, and one question that made me think about was, how much attention do you pay or should you give to changing the rules, changing the laws? How much effort and resources should be dedicated to that? And maybe associated with that, how much attention or focus from the innovators should be given to the decision makers and governance, systems of governance, particularly for districts who are making some of these critical decisions?
That's a great question. So from our organization's perspective, we don't typically get involved in that. And that's just simply because we don't have the resources. If I were to look at changing policy, I would probably focus at the state, not at the federal level. I think you'll get a lot further in terms of the ability to make real changes faster. And I think we need organizations doing that. So I'm a big fan of that. I think people need to be doing that. I think policy is a big hindrance, especially when it comes to assessment. And that's, often dictated at the federal level, but really decided at the state level, at least the bully pulpit anyway.
And local, education in this country is local, and so education or local policy is also critically important. You hear the term evidence-based policy, which sounds like just a buzzword, which it kind of is. But it just means, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like really consider the kinds of policies and where a policy has enabled something in another place. But I would also, maybe not right now, maybe after, I'd love to hear your answer to that question too, because usually people have like, here's a law or something that I wish would change.
I'd love for people to really think outside of the box on this. And so while it's probably, if you're inside a district office, it's pretty difficult to navigate and it's a full-time job. I would love to see somebody interested in the public good fund a visionary district superintendent that can opt out of state assessments. And the only way they do that, you have to supplement the federal dollars and the state dollars that you get with the choice to opt out of state assessments, which is in the millions. Give them 5 years and let's see what happens. Fund that project. I think that'll change policy overnight.
Well, like what's happening in New Hampshire.
And there are some places that. So, but I'd love to see that in more pockets around the U.S.
Yeah, and for us, it's definitely not an in-house capability or function that we have, but we do have a number of strategic partnerships with other policy groups that we need them and they need us. So for us, it just feels like the right marriage, the right connection. Folks like Learning Policy Institute, Alliance for Excellent Education, there's actually a thread within the Council for Chief State School Officers, all the commissioners of education across the country that are having a dialogue around some of the different barriers that don't allow for some of the more innovative practices. So, but it's definitely not an in-house capability in terms of, for our organization.
I think we have time for one more question or conversation. Oh, go ahead.
First, I just wanted to say thank you for this panel. That's such an
Oh, well, thank you.
My question's around when you're talking about creating and scaling innovation, I feel like it's hard to escape the fact that measuring that impact of the innovation is really important. I'm wondering if each of you can speak a little bit about how you think about that within your organization and how you report that impact back out.
Yeah, so I'll jump in. So measure. There are all sorts of measures. It's hard. I'm not going to say this. Just measure it. It's easy. It's hard, and it gets back to your comment about the measuring the kinds of skills that aren't necessarily measured on standardized tests, right? So you have a lot of indicators of engagement, attendance, and behavior, and surveys, and like you mentioned the Gallup survey before. There are a lot of measures for a variety of things. So first, thinking about what you're trying to impact. But I will say, without kind of boiling it down to something measurable, because you also don't want to ignore all of the other context factors. So I think that's one thing. So in general, there are a lot of measures to be had, but really kind of taking the time to figure out what you are going to measure. What we measure in our organization is we measure reach, right? So that's important, and you can measure with Google Analytics and that kind of thing. We measure impact, and that's especially in the schools that we work with. We also measure what we call innovative outputs. Are we doing something that is different than just publishing a paper, or not just, papers are great, but what are the other ways of making something really understandable and accessible, and then measure kind of growth, so as an organization. Go ahead.
Papers are great.
Papers are great.
Yeah,
white papers, we need more white papers.
Yeah, so since we're primarily a kind of secondary school model, so primarily high schools and some middle schools in our network. So we really start thinking about, in addition to the in-time data points that come out that measure success of schools, is also longitudinally. Like, we want to know if our students, how are they succeeding and thriving after they leave our community and our spaces. So we're excited, again, in partnership with other research groups, is to hear that so many of our young people, but close to 3/4 of our young people, are landing and securing family-sustaining employment, and it was directly connected to some of their learning opportunities in school. For us, that's a very pointed, very clear data point that we're very proud of. We're also very excited about like the young people that choose to go on to college, that are persisting and succeeding at high rates. Like graduation is great, right? We need to get them to graduate. That's the function of the school, but it's got to be beyond that. Yeah. So for us, it's some of those measures.
I would just quickly add that for us, so because we talk about the unit of change being the district office, we measure inputs as it relates to a school district and their advancement through the stages of the framework that we wrote. And then on the output side, we look at individual districts and we look at their ability to reduce the achievement gap for kids that are living below the poverty line. And then we're also looking at and trying to highlight districts that are trying to completely redefine metrics. So another example would be, not to pick on the great people from Cajon, but they're looking at happiness. And could that be a student metric? So we're trying to highlight districts that are trying to do some things that are outside of the box that contribute to kids' well-being, to being happy and healthy, and contributing back to society.
And I would say for Transcend, we, of course, do reach the number of schools served and schools reached, then codified models, the number of schools that models have scaled to and been adopted by. At the same time, we also have a big line of knowledge products. So for example, why should every school in the country reinvent what their graduate aims are? So we've created a really functional graduate aims database that's research-based, that has kind of summaries of 2-pagers on different graduate aims and places you can research further. So if you want to build a new graduate profile, here are 50 possible graduate aims. Instead of going down that Google, black hole, you can just start from there. So we build a bunch of tools that let processes speed up at the community level. Mm-hmm. So I think we're out of time. Are we? Yes, we are. They're nodding.
They're like, yes.
They're vehemently nodding. Can we all thank our wonderful panel? We could use another hour. Thank you.